Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We are getting started now. My name is Megan Weldon, and it is my honor to be the Executive Director of OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. And what a year this week has been, huh? For those who are new to OLLI, we provide exciting educational, social, and volunteer opportunities designed especially by and for people 50 years and better, but open to everyone. We're one of 124 OLLIs around the country with the same mission, and each of the OLLIs are associated with a different college or university, from UC Berkeley to Duke to right here in the Berkshires. And I believe we have members of other OLLIs joining us today. So I wanted to say welcome, as well as our own members and members of the public. Not only do we offer terrific talks and programs like today's, we also offer 5 semesters of classes each year in science, history, the arts, and more, with no tests, no grades, just learning for the love of learning. Our next semester, winter, begins in just a little less than 2 weeks on January 19th, and you can find out more about our classes there on our website at berkshireolli.org. So today it is my great pleasure to introduce Roselle Chartock, author of the new book, The Jewish World of Elvis Presley. Welcome, Roselle. Roselle is a fabulous person. She is known by some as a lovely Roselle, which doesn't even cover it all, but it is a very appropriate moniker. She is a retired professor and teacher and educational leader. She's written books about education. She's organized trips for students and faculty, educational ones as well. She is a wonderful collage artist. She's a visual artist, and she's a writer. She is a Berkshire's Renaissance woman. Most recently, she wrote a book about and I forgot the name of this. What's the name of the school?
Windsor Mountain School.
Windsor Mountain School, which, like Roselle, is very unique, very progressive, and really interesting and forward-thinking school that was here in the Berkshires. And we could go off on a very long tangent on that, but we'll try to stay focused today. She's also written books about the Holocaust, as well as education. And am I missing any?
History.
History.
But you got most of it.
Okay, yeah. So it's very exciting. So we're delighted to have Roselle here today on Elvis's 86th birthday. And I realized I should have been playing Elvis Presley songs while we were waiting for this to begin, but we haven't quite figured out how to do music on Zoom. That's always something new to learn. But I am very excited to hear her story. She's got a lot of them, and she did 5 years of research on the book, which just came out like a month ago, right? Yeah. And we'll send information out afterwards about how to purchase the book, because you'll want to after you hear from Roselle. So please join me in welcoming Roselle Kline Chartock.
Thank you, Megan, so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be talking to all kinds of folks. I know you're all over the world, all over the country, and this is really very special. And I appreciate the opportunity to share this book and the stories that it contains. There are many, many stories, and I'm excited about telling them to you, at least a few of them. And also I'm excited that some people are out there who I actually do know. I've already seen on the chat line that some people have said hello who I haven't talked to in a while. So this is really a wonderful technological feat, and I'm delighted. What I hope to do this afternoon is to tell you a lot of stories, because I had fun collecting them. I had fun interviewing wonderful people. And the writing wasn't that much fun, but anyway, once it all came together, I felt like I had done justice to my thesis. So what I think I'll start out with is just telling you very briefly what my thesis is, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then I'm going to tell you some good stories about some interesting folks. So first I'm going to start with how, what the thesis is. The thesis is basically that this man who came from very deep Southern roots, Pentecostal church, an area of the world that is known sometimes for its anti-Semitism, somehow he rose above those attitudes and he became one of the most unprejudiced people imaginable. And I will share some of that with you, how that came to be. And I tried to address two questions. How did this man who had this very unusual background come to have an affinity to Jews? How did that happen? And the second question is, what is the nature of the relationships that he had with so many Jews at different times of his life, of his short life? The truth is that Elvis got around, as you know, through his movie making and the singing and the concertizing and so on. So some of these people are, of course, from the South and from Memphis, and others from other areas where he was obviously making movies and so on. But the main thing is that there are lots of them, lots of good people, and I'll probably only be able to touch on a few of them, but there's over 25 of these sort of profiles, these stories about his relationships. So I think also I'll start with this question that I posed at the beginning. The fact is that in explaining how he came to have this affinity, one of his inner circle said that, well, he had this affinity to Jews because, you know, it's just a coincidence, you know, it's just like it happened, you know, and they all sort of entered his life. But there was another member of that group who said, Alan Fortas was his name. He was the nephew of Justice Abe Fortas. The Fortases were a very prominent Memphis family. At any rate, Alan Fortas said about, you know, Elvis's having Jews around, you know, such an affinity to Jews. He said, it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. He said, there are lots of reasons why this happened. One of them, which you'll hear about and which I'll share with you, has to do with his own Jewish roots. Elvis, according to Jewish law, is Jewish, and I'll explain that in a minute. Secondly, Alan Fortas said, the reason Elvis was attracted to Jews is based on those he met in his earliest years in Memphis. He said he really formed this connection to Jews because of, quote, a kind and wonderful student that he met at Humes High School. George Klein was his name. He became fond of Jews because of the kindness of a rabbi and his family. He lived downstairs from this rabbi, and I'll tell you about him. And he formed this connection because of the kindness of so many Jewish merchants he met and befriended in Memphis, one of whom you will meet also, Bernard Lansky. So there's, and I actually came to believe that Alan was right, that Alan Fortas was right, that Elvis did not forget the people who were kind to him in the time of his worst poverty and pain as a child growing up, amongst a lot of difficulty. It wasn't easy. And also, he didn't forget that the Jewish Community Center in Memphis gave him a free membership because he was among the poor kids who couldn't afford it. That's where he started playing racquetball, by the way. He became quite a good racquetball player. He built a racquetball court at Graceland. Some of you may be aware of that. At any rate, I think the conclusion I made was the same as Alan Fortas. It wasn't a coincidence. There are lots of reasons why he surrounded himself with Jews. Oh, and there's one other thesis on that. One author who I read said, you know, Vernon was Elvis's father. Vernon was a virulent anti-Semite, his father, not obviously his mother, but his father would say things, very racist, not very nice things about Jews to Elvis. And Elvis rose above that, and he looked at reality, and what he saw was a very different kind of thing. And this author said he thought one of the reasons that Elvis drew a lot of Jews around him had to do with a form of rebellion against the prejudices of his father, which makes Elvis a pretty special guy, in my opinion. So now I'm going to tell you how I came to write the book. It's sort of an indirect way of arriving at this topic. I happen to love vintage clothing. Those of you who know me know that I collect vintage dresses and I wear them and I have fun. It's a lot of fun. And so one night I was lying in bed and I'm thinking about all these vintage clothes that I like. And for some reason, I have no idea why this happened. As you know, when you're lying there in bed, you don't know why things come into your head. But anyway, what came into my head was a picture in my mind of Elvis Presley in the 1950s on the Ed Sullivan Show with a plaid jacket and cool pants. And I said, oh, I really like his fashion. And so then I said, oh, I wonder who his tailor was. Now, that's kind of crazy, but that's what happened. I said, okay, I wonder who his tailor is. I grabbed my iPhone, I went to Google, and I wrote in the words, Elvis Presley's tailor. And what came up was the Lansky Brothers. And I thought that, well, that's kind of interesting. That's a Jewish name. And so he had a Jewish tailor, but that's not a big deal because a lot of Jewish tailors were in Memphis at the time. But it intrigued me because I just never thought of the idea of Elvis and Jews. I mean, those were two words that did not go together in my mind. And I should not have made that assumption. I always taught my students, never make assumptions about people. Find out what they are and who they are, and then you will have the truth. Stereotypes are not the truth. But I had made an assumption about Elvis that, you know, he might have known a Jewish tailor, but he certainly wasn't his friend. But what I found out when I started to do some research that very night, as a matter of fact, I put in, some question about the Lanskys. And what came up is that they not only sold him clothes, he not only loved their clothing, but he also became a very close friend of Elvis's. Bernard Lansky was a 25, 30-year friend of, well, since Elvis was 17 years old, friend of Elvis's. And I'm going to tell you that story shortly. It's a great story about that friendship. So anyway, now you know how I came to write the book, because I had this sort of vision that, oh, maybe there's other Jews that he had befriended. Like maybe Bernard is not the only one. So that's when I started to do some research, and I was very anxious to get going because I was excited about finding a topic that I had just finished writing a book, as Megan referenced. I had finished writing a book about Windsor Mountain and it came out and I was very happy, and I was missing doing research. I really love that process. And I was searching for a topic, and that night with my iPhone in my hand, I felt, I think I found my next topic. And so I began the research, and it was like taking, like peeling an onion. You peel one part and you find out that he had Jewish roots. You peel another, that he had 5 or 6 merchants who were his friends. You peel another, you find out that his inner circle, the Memphis Mafia they were called, half of them were Jews. How could that be? And then that he lived downstairs from a rabbi and became friends with the family. I mean, this is what started to happen, and it was really very special. And one last point I'll make before I tell you all these stories is that just at the very beginning of the research, when I was looking into his Jewish roots, I found out that his grandmother on his father's side, that her first name was Rosella. Now, I don't know about that coincidence or stronger powers out there, but when I found that out, I knew this was it. This was the story I had to tell. So now I'm going to tell you about some of these amazing people. I'll start with the Jewish roots, I think, are the place to start before I get into talking about these very special friends. There was a woman, Elaine Dundee, who happens to be a Jewish author, who wrote a book about Elvis and Gladys, about Elvis and his mother. I'm just going to show you a picture of the family. This is Elvis at 3 years old. I hope you can see that. And Elvis the roots of the family were the topic of her book, among other things. And she told the story of the lineage of Elvis Presley. And it was fascinating because apparently she uncovered the fact that he had a Jewish great-great-grandmother named Nancy Burdine, maybe Sarah Burdine, we're not sure. And in that family, in her family were two men who had the name of Jerome and Sidney, typically Jewish names. And she traced the lineage from 1840, Nancy Burdine, who married who married a guy whose last name was Tackett. And then she traced it all the way down 5 generations of women. And according to Jewish law, if you are descended from a straight line of women, that makes you a Jew. And so there was Gladys Love Smith marrying Miss Vernon Presley, and she was part of that lineage, therefore making Elvis a Jew, despite the fact that he never practiced and he never went to synagogue. But according to Jewish law, Elvis Presley is Jewish because of what they call, it's called halakhic law, Jewish law. So how do we know that this is really true? I mean, she said she talked to a descendant of the Tackett family that Nancy Burdine married into. And she got some documents, and she went to the library and she found all of these different things, but nothing in her book was shown as like black and white evidence. It's fact. So I kept searching, and lo and behold, what started to happen was this amazing discovery during my research. Elvis, after his mother had died, and she died at a young age, 46, in 1958, a few years after she was buried in Memphis, he went to the cemetery with 2 of his Jewish friends, Marty Lacker and Larry Geller. And he said, you know, I think I want to put a Star of David on my mother's grave. Now, how did he come to that? Well, Larry and Marty and a few of his other Jewish friends said in either to me or in their writing that Elvis told them that his mother once sat him down as a young man and said, you know, Elvis, we have Jewish blood, but don't tell anybody because people don't like Jews. So Marty and Larry knew this story. And so it wasn't surprising when he said that he might want to put a Star of David on his mother's grave. And Larry helped make that happen. And there it was. There's a photograph of that original grave with a Jewish star on the left and a cross on the right, and her name and a beautiful phrase. So now, 1977, Elvis dies. And it's many years, so from 58 to 77. And he's buried next to his mother. And Vernon decides that, you know, he's a little concerned about grave robbing. So he thinks, I'm going to take Elvis's grave and I'm going to take Gladys's grave and I'm going to have them transported to Graceland, and then we're going to establish plaques, for them. So when that happened, that was the end of that grave site, that gravestone rather. Nobody knew what happened to it. It was gone. And so there was no evidence at Graceland from 1977 on to indicate that Elvis had any kind of Jewish background and ancestry. And that was obviously purposely done by his father, who, as I say, was, there's a lot of evidence that I was given by some of Elvis's friends to the effect that Vernon was not a liberal, let's put it that way, and not a very tolerant person when it came to Jews. At any rate, so in 2018, the most amazing thing happened, and I'm very grateful that I hadn't finished the book by then, because in 2018, the most amazing thing, a woman by the name of Angie Marchese, who is the archivist at Graceland, was going through the millions of objects that are in this gigantic warehouse of Elvis memorabilia, etc. And she came upon a broken grave. And she said, I'm going to put this together. I'm going to restore this, have it refurbished, and I'm going to have it placed in the meditation garden. And so from 2018 on, people for the first time since 1977 were able to see Gladys's grave as Elvis wanted it to look. And Angie Marchese said, this is what Elvis would have wanted. Essentially, he was proud of his heritage. He was proud of his mother's heritage. He wanted people to know. And so if you go to Graceland now, and it's worth a visit, it's a little kitsch and a little fun, but it's mostly really a wonderful experience, I have to admit. Alan and I went down there and just had a really wonderful time, and went through all of Graceland and the mansion and so on. And we were there before, we were there earlier than 2018, of course. We were there in 2016. But if we go back, and I hope to do that, I can't wait to see that gravestone. So there's the look at his roots. There's a little more about that in the book, but you have the idea now that, hey, this man had Jewish ancestry. Who would have thought? So now I wanted to introduce you to some of the people in Elvis's life who are responsible for his affinity to Jews. The first one is Rabbi Alfred Fruchter, his wife Jeanette, and their beginning of a family when they were living downstairs from the Presleys. Excuse me, the Presleys were downstairs from the rabbi and his family. How did that happen? Well, you know, Memphis is this kind of city which a lot of people went to. I mean, the Presleys went from Tupelo to Memphis to make a better life. The rabbi had his first opportunity at a Jewish school to become the head of it. And so they found themselves living in the same duplex on Alabama Street, which was in the area of Memphis known as the Pinch. By the way, the book contains a whole chapter on Memphis Jewry and the history of that Jewry. And there's reference to the fact that a lot of Jews started out, a lot of the immigrant Jews, a lot of the poor Jews started out in the Pinch. And they worked their way out of that area into better circumstances. And that was the nature of what happened to both families, the Presleys and the rabbi's family. So you had the rabbi living upstairs with his family, the Presleys downstairs, and their relationship, it was so unique and so, I mean, really, I think today, every time I tell this story, I still can't believe what a special relationship they had. I mean, obviously I'm talking about Gladys and Elvis and their relationship with the rabbi and his wife. I don't know where to start, but basically everything that Elvis learned about Judaism started with the rabbi. The music, for example, the music was coming out of the windows, cantors playing, you know, wonderful cantorial music that the rabbi played. Elvis heard every note and he loved that music. They would invite him to Sabbath dinner and Elvis would have wear a yarmulke because the Orthodox Jewish rabbi was wearing his yarmulke. So they gave him one and he wore it and he put it in his pocket so it would always be there whenever he had dinner with them. He became what they call, we no longer use the term Shabbos goy, but a Sabbath helper to the rabbi and his family. And so he would turn the lights on, for example, on the Sabbath, because Orthodox Jews do not turn the lights on Sabbath. And whenever he did this, Jeanette would offer him money because she said, well, that, you know, it just seemed like that's what you do when someone's helping you out. But he would always say, no, Mrs. Fruchter, I'm happy to do this. I'm happy to do this. I want to do it. And so he became their Sabbath helper. Then he learned to enjoy his very wonderful meal of peanut butter and banana sandwiches. He began to eat them on challah because they introduced him to challah, and he loved that combination. And then he ate simis, which is this carrot dish, and many other wonderful meals that they offered him and that he enjoyed thoroughly. So he came to know, and he came to know a little bit of Yiddish. He learned about the holidays. He very much was a part of their life. And one other thing I should add is that the record player, he didn't have a record player, that the Presleys were too poor to have a record player, too poor to have a telephone. And so they used the Fruchter's telephone and phonograph at that most incredibly special time in Elvis's life, when he began that rise to stardom. That very first record, That's All Right Mama, which suddenly turned him into a national name and eventually international name. That happened, that breakthrough happened during the year that those two families lived above one another, near one another. And so when the record was made, he brought it home and he played it on the Fruchter's record player. And when the calls of congratulations flooded that phone, it was the Fruchter's phone that he talked on. And there's wonderful stories about the relationship that Jeanette had with Gladys. She would invite her for tea and cake, and they would often talk about, you know, Elvis and other things. And there's one anecdote of the book, where apparently Gladys said to Jeanette, you know, I'm a little worried about Elvis. He doesn't do that well in school, and I wanted him to become a doctor, but I don't know if that can happen. And Jeanette supposedly says that she said to Gladys, listen, don't worry, he's a good boy. He'll make you proud someday. Well, needless to say, he made her very proud, although she didn't much like a lot of the fame invading their privacy, but she was indeed very proud of her son. So this rabbi eventually left Alabama Street, as did Elvis. Elvis's family moved into their first house, that they owned their first house soon after this thing happened, and this breakthrough happened. And then the rabbi also moved out to a pulpit out in San Francisco. So what happened out there was that Elvis is giving a concert, and the rabbi says, I think I'll go and I'll say hi to Elvis, and haven't seen him for a while, and, you know, congratulate him. So the rabbi wrote out a message, and he went to the concert hall. He wrote out a message and he sent it back, so it would be brought backstage. And what happened was George Klein, who was bar mitzvahed by that rabbi, thought to himself, how does Rabbi Fruchter know Elvis? And so he took the message to Elvis and he said, how did this happen? And Elvis said, well, I lived downstairs from the Fruchters for a year, and he was a wonderful person, and we became friends, and that's how I know him. And they were good people. And so at that point, George Klein brought the rabbi to the backstage, and Elvis hugged the rabbi, and it was a wonderful reunion, and they had a wonderful catching up. And Elvis said, you know, I'm about to go to this press conference. I have to talk to these reporters. Why don't you come with me? So he brought the rabbi with him to the press conference, and he said to the reporters, I want you all to meet my rabbi. So that is pretty exciting. And, you know, you get teary when you think about these heartwarming stories. So that, unfortunately, was the last time that they did see one another. But what happened was Jeanette and the rabbi sort of lost track of Elvis and so on. But years later, when he really became famous, they were very sad to watch the whole downturn and the drug problems that came towards the end of Elvis's life. But when he died, that's when suddenly all of these reporters, all of the media descended upon the rabbi and his family. They wanted to know everything about their relationship with him. And what they said was only that he was a beautiful boy, a wonderful boy. He was like a son. And Jeanette said he was one of the greatest mensches, great men that I've ever met. So, you know, these are the kinds of stories that are in the book. I mean, I must say that that one is really one of the most touching ones, and I get very teary when I talk about it. So now I think I have time to tell you a little bit about another very important person in Elvis's life. And believe me, I wish I could talk about so many more. I feel terrible about leaving out so many, but I do want to talk about Bernard Lansky. When Alan and I went down to, that's Murray, my dog, if you can hear him. But anyway, when Alan and I went down to Memphis back in 2016, it was a very special time because Hal Lansky, who is the son of Bernard, who started Lansky Brothers clothing store, known as the clothier to the king, Hal was incredibly hospitable, and he brought Alan and me all over the city. He showed us Hume's High School, where Elvis attended, Lauderdale Courts, the public housing that he lived in, the record shops he shopped in, the Sun Studios, where he made that first record. And so Hal was incredibly helpful then, and he continued to be, by the way, throughout the time that I wrote the book. And also Hal has written the foreword to the book, and it's a wonderful foreword. So Hal was only 9, or remembers meeting, knowing Elvis when he was 9 years old, and he really didn't, it was his father, Bernard, who had the very strong relationship with Elvis. But he does remember as he was growing up and able to drive, he would take a truckload of clothing out to Graceland so that Elvis would not have to worry about shopping with crowds and so on. And Hal said, it was rare. It was a rare time that I would ever end up taking any clothing back to the store. Elvis loved everything that the Lanskys had, and he loved, and he usually took it all. But let me tell you about this very heartwarming story about how that relationship started. So Elvis was working as an usher at this theater, Lowe's Theater, which is right around the corner from Beale Street. Beale Street was, in a nutshell, Beale Street was the center of Black life. Blacks shopped there, Blacks ate there, Blacks listened to music there, Blacks hung out on the streets there. It was a Black community and a place which very few white people would hang out, except for all the stores there were owned by Jews, Schwab's, Lanskys, etc. Many, many Jewish-owned stores on that street. So it was a very fascinating street. And, I have a friend, Don McGrory, who was brought up in Memphis, and he says that it's not the same anymore. It's not what it was. They dug it all up. They had urban renewal and so on, and it's just not the same. It's a place for tourists now, but Lansky's is still there. And so getting back to how did they meet? So here you have this usher wearing his uniform, his usher's uniform, pimply faced and greasy hair, and just, not what you would think of as Elvis Presley. And he would go to the store and hang out in front looking at the clothing in the windows. Why? Because those were the clothes that the Black dudes on Beale Street wore. They were snazzy, they were colorful, they were cool, and he wanted in on those clothes, but he didn't have any money. So he would just come and just sort of see what was out there. And he'd turn around and look again the next day. And finally, Bernard, who is seeing this guy hanging out every day, looking at the clothes, he says, maybe I'll invite him in. So he invites Elvis in and says, hi, and they introduce each other. And Elvis says to him, someday I'm going to buy you out. And Bernard said to him, well, I don't want you to buy me out. I just want you to buy from me. And that's the legend that I was told about the first meeting. And Bernard said right away, this is a special young man. This guy who I just described to you in his uniform and looking a little down and out, he knew right away that there was something special about Elvis, and he liked him, and he nurtured him, and he invited, they formed this wonderful relationship. There's so many stories attached to that, which I can't go into right now, but the beautiful thing is that when he started to buy, he took his measly little check from the Lowe's Theater, and he started to buy a shirt or a pair of pants or something, whatever he could afford at that point. And then when it came time to his prom, to go to his junior and senior prom, he ended up probably renting a pink and black tuxedo, which he wore to the Peabody Hotel, which is another interesting story in the book, which is where the prom was taking place. And then just before he went on to the Ed Sullivan Show, he needed some really decent clothes. And it was at that point that the Lanskys became one of the first people to extend credit to Elvis. And he began to buy, what he wore on the Sullivan Show were clothes from Lansky Brothers. Listen, I could go on and on about Lanskys, but I'm just gonna say one last thing about that, because I wanna just touch on a couple of other things. Bernard was a character. Bernard, came over from Europe. He was very garrulous. He would use Yiddish with the thickest Southern accent you could imagine. In fact, one of his favorite sayings in Yiddish was "Nachamol," this too, or this again. It's sort of said in frustration or exasperation, and that would be his thing, "Nachamol." And many of you out there who know a little Yiddish will say that's familiar. He would just use expressions like that all the time. And the wonderful thing about Bernard is that he would tell people that there's not a time that a tourist comes to Graceland that they don't also stop at Lansky Brothers. Why is that? Because they feel like this is where Elvis shopped. It's like a sacred place. I want to go where Elvis shopped. And of course, Hal tells me, this was the greatest gift to them, because, you don't go to Graceland without stopping at Lansky Brothers before you go home. And I think the way that Bernard put it was, it's sort of like they feel like they're going to shul, going to the synagogue, to a holy place to say Kaddish, but instead this is a happy time. This is not a prayer for the dead. This is praising God that they can go to the place where Elvis shopped. So it's a beautiful story. It was a wonderful relationship. And on a sadder note, as I sometimes get a little teary about this too, when Elvis died, he was buried in a white suit from Lansky Brothers. And, it's pretty moving stuff. And he also wrote, I think he had a full page ad in the local paper dedicated to this man, Elvis Presley, who he loved so much. So another story, and I really hope I can tell a little bit more about this one too. I hope there's time. And that is the story of one of the members of Elvis's inner circle, the Memphis Mafia. That's what they were called. And as I might have said earlier, they were comprised of at least 5 or 6 Jews. And Larry Geller was one of them. Larry, I'm singling him out for the very important reason that that's where Elvis learned so much about the Jewish religion, so much about the symbolism of the Kabbalah and Gematria, and the meaning of his name, and the meaning of the Chai. I don't know if you're aware that Elvis wore a Chai and a Star of David around his neck when he became aware of the meaning of that letter, meaning life. L'chaim, some of you are familiar with Chai, meaning life. Elvis learned so much. And why did he do that? Why did he want to learn? Because Larry came into his life at a time when Elvis was searching for answers. Why am I Elvis? Why did I become this famous person? Why did I survive when my twin brother died at birth. These were questions that he struggled with, and the Jewish religion and Kabbalah and Larry, with all of the books that he provided for Elvis, which Elvis just read from cover to cover, he provided Elvis with so many answers and such a rich bit of knowledge that Elvis could use to help him through his difficult times. And the thing of Larry has many, many stories. He was wonderful. I mean, I would call Larry or I would email him and I would instantly get an answer. He wouldn't wait a second. He would get right back to me. And among the stories that he told me that really are evidence of Elvis's just anger about anti-Semitism, tremendous anger about prejudice. He hated to see this kind of thing. And so he would tell Larry some of these stories, and Larry was with him on certain occasions that made those stories appropriate. For example, he would tell Larry, Larry, I go to church, I go to the Assembly of God Church, and all of the people are sitting there praising Moses and praising the Ezekiel and praising the prophets and singing all of these hymns. And here they are praising all these Jews in my church. But when they walk out of that church, I start hearing them say, those goddamn Jews, those damn Jews. I don't get it, Larry, he said. I don't get it. What kind of thing? How can they say one thing in the walls of the church and then they come out and then they spew these kinds of things? And so he was so cognizant of that. And another thing was, Larry told me a wonderful story about how Elvis was so aware of the contributions of Jews to civilization. And he said, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was a rabbi, right, Larry? And what about Freud? And what about Einstein? I mean, these were the great thinkers of the world. And he said, I bet if we did a real history and we went way back, way back, we'd find that everybody had Jewish blood. I don't know if I'd go that far and agree with him, but that's what he said to Larry, that we all came from the same place. This is a man whose philosophy and freedom from any kind of prejudice really needs to be recognized at this time in our history. And I won't go into any more detail on that. We all know what we're talking about here. And so it was just, there's one more example I can think of. I mean, I could go on about Larry, but Elvis was once in a hotel room with Larry, and they were watching television, and a film about the Holocaust came on. And Elvis started to put his fist up into the air, and he started to cry and to curse. And I won't use the words here, but basically saying, God damn those Nazis. And he was angry. So this is the man we're talking about. This is a very special human being who I really did not know until I did this research, and who I came to love as a result of the research. Love very much. So the stories about Larry could go on and on, but maybe if I have another minute, I would like to reference a local, someone who's local to my area here, who lived in Great Barrington. He died a few years ago, but I interviewed his wife. Who is this person, you wonder? He was one of Elvis's songwriters, Aaron Schroeder. Aaron Schroeder wrote 5 of Elvis's #1 hits. It's Now or Never, Good Luck Charm, and so on. It's Now or Never, everyone knows that. That is, if nothing else, they know Heartbreak Hotel. Let's talk about Heartbreak Hotel. How did Aaron break through as the songwriter? Aaron wrote the B-side to Heartbreak Hotel. That was step 1 to getting into 5 #1 hits. So Aaron we got to know, Alan and I got to know the Schroeders, and Aaron was a wonderful guy, and Abby, his wife, equally wonderful. And she gave me, 5 hours of her time to tell me about the history of Aaron and Elvis. One anecdote, there are a couple of anecdotes, but one was that, he would sit down at the piano, or Aaron would, and Elvis would try out the song. And one time he went he sat down with Aaron and he said, "I'm not getting it right." And he had tears in his eyes because Elvis was a perfectionist. He would not do something that wasn't exactly to his standards. And then when he got it right, he would be so happy and they would celebrate. And so he and Aaron had a wonderful relationship that way. And when they would talk, apparently Aaron knew about the ancestry, his Jewish ancestry. And so they realized that Aaron realized that Elvis's middle name was Aaron. And as Abby would say, so the two Aarons would talk, Aaron being the middle name of Elvis Presley. So there was a bond over that. And I should say that the songwriting chapter is fascinating. And one of the things that Aaron contended with was anti-Semitism himself because of his name. And there were people who said to him, "Aaron, you should change your last name. Schroeder sounds too Jewish." But he didn't do it, and he stayed with his name. But there was this relationship between a songwriter and, well, there's one other songwriter who I wasn't going to talk about, but it's such a beautiful story, Billy Goldenberg. It's a great story. Billy Goldenberg was the music director for the '68 comeback special, which is a long story, but Elvis was giving up the films that he was in, and he was coming back to live concerts. And so this was a special, and Billy Goldenberg didn't like the fact that he had to put up with the Memphis Mafia being there when he was trying to work with Elvis on trying to get this program together. And so he finally complained, and so the producer or the director said, "Okay, I'll get rid of the Memphis Mafia. They won't be there. You can just meet with Elvis one-on-one, that's fine." And Goldenberg remembers that first time when he walked into the studio and there was Elvis playing Moonlight Sonata. And Goldenberg said, "Oh, so you know that?" And Elvis said, yeah, I do. And then Goldenberg sits down at the piano and he starts to play it also. And Elvis says, "I was looking for how to do that. Can you show me?" And he shows him how to play it. And the two of them, 4 hands, playing Moonlight Sonata together. And that scene to me is a beautiful one, because this is the kind of person he was. He formed relationships with people who appreciated him, who respected him, and he had this talent for the piano. I don't know if many of you know that his first instrument was not the guitar, it was the piano. He played by ear. He was born with the gift of being able to sit down at a piano and play beautifully. In fact, you can go to YouTube and you'll hear Elvis trying to figure out how to play Hava Nagila, which is a Hebrew folk song, and isn't quite singing it, but trying it out. But there's otherwise, there are no other references on YouTube to that. So Aaron was definitely an important part of Elvis's career. And there's a fellow named Alan Hansen who has an Elvis blog, and he tried to figure out who were the top 10 songwriters that Elvis Presley had, the top 10. And he wrote about it, and I noticed that 8 out of those top 10 were Jews. And it's sort of unfortunate that some of these people never got the kind of recognition that they deserved in terms of, when a song came out, it was the singer and it was the song, but you never heard about the songwriter. Well, I've tried to do my part in bringing to life these 8 songwriters and who they were and where they came from, and the amazing stuff that they produced. Amazing. Okay, so last but not least, and maybe I'll just do this one and then we can have some questions. Let me show you a picture here. I was going to show you a lot of pictures, but hey, just didn't work out. But you can buy the book and you can see the pictures. There's over 60 pictures in the book. But I want to show you this one. You got that? This is Elvis backstage. He's 21 years old, and he's flirting with this young woman. I write briefly about a photographer named Alfred Wertheimer. Alfred Wertheimer followed Elvis Presley as he was reaching stardom, and he traveled with him for 3 months, and he took thousands of pictures. And now there's a coffee table book called Elvis at 21, all huge black and white photographs that Alfred Wertheimer took. And they're stunning. And he talks about how, you know, there's a wonderful thing where Elvis even lets him get into the bathroom with him, into his bedroom, into every place, so he can take these candid photographs. And in one of them, Elvis is pulling up his fly, and he didn't seem to care that, you know, that he was there, that the photographer was there. And so there's some inside pictures, so to speak. But as far as the picture that I just showed you, that's called The Kiss. It's one of the more famous photographs, and I think probably some of you've seen it already. But Wertheimer said that when he was backstage and he saw this interaction with this young woman and Elvis, his technique as a photographer is to be a fly on the wall. They didn't even know he was there. They were just unaware completely. And he watched this whole thing of Elvis putting out his tongue and she's putting out her tongue, and they just barely touch. It is truly an amazing photograph. But so are all the rest of them, and I wish I could share all of them with you. So I could go on, but I would love to hear from you, because I know that your questions will elicit some other aspects of the story that I haven't talked about.
Well, I know I speak for everyone here that we could listen to your stories all day. You're such a wonderful storyteller, and the stories are so beautiful that it's just a real treat to be here with you today, Roselle. Thank you. We've got a bunch of questions and also lots of wonderful comments. Debbie Kane writes, I always knew Elvis was a sensitive and sweet man, but he was obviously much kinder than I knew. My mom adored him because he had such wonderful manners. Thank you for these wonderful personal stories. And Holly Hardman says, I love the way you're telling these stories. Just many people saying how much they're enjoying it. And then many questions too. So the first one that came through was, did the king ever play the Catskills?
Not to my knowledge. I did not see any references. You know, the key places were, of course, Las Vegas, Las Vegas, Las Vegas. And then he did, of course, tour the country. And he in fact, just before he died, and I didn't get into that side of the story, but he died the morning of the day that they were supposed to go to Portland, Maine on tour. So he was all over the place, but I don't know of any references to the Catskills. It's possible.
Sure. And Barbara asked, how old was he when he visited the rabbi?
Oh, he was 17. Oh, when he visited the rabbi, I'm sorry. So that's an interesting, okay. So he'd already made it pretty big because he was out there in Hollywood or in San Francisco rather. I'm not sure. I'd have, I could look it up in the book, but it was several years later. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Chris Carson asked, what was the relationship with Colonel Parker and his Jewish connections?
That's a whole other story, which is very much in the book. Okay. I'll be very brief because Elvis needed the Colonel. The Colonel was a manager who was strong and knew where to place his boy. It's his boy. And he also knew how to make money from his boy. That's the downside of this Colonel, is that he was a gambler and he liked to make money and he liked to gamble. And so He had to keep his boy making money at all costs. But he also knew where to place him, as I said. He got him the contracts. He says, we're going to make $1 million movie before this is over. And sure enough, he got all of that done. But he was not, and by the way, there's two sides, it's like Jekyll and Hyde or whatever. He had a very positive side. There are people who say, yeah, Elvis might not have been able to do all this without him. On the other hand, the other side of him was he did not give Elvis the kinds of opportunities that he should have. And one of the reasons is, and this is a fascinating part of the story, there is an idea, it's been written about, that the colonel who came from Holland had possibly murdered someone there. This is what has been written, that there was never solid evidence, but that he had to get the heck out of the Netherlands, and he came here without a passport. And when he went back, he to see family or something, he, again, without a passport. And the thesis is that he never took Elvis on any international concert tours because he was afraid he wouldn't get back in the country without.
Wow.
It's a very complex story, but you want my conclusion on the man? I didn't like him. And you can read the book and find out why.
And a couple of people have asked, what's the name of the book again? And it is The Jewish World of Elvis Presley. It is available on Amazon, and we'll send a link out to everyone along with a link to the recording today so that you can share it with friends or watch it again if you want. But if you live here in Berkshire County and you want to support our wonderful independent bookstores, you can also buy it from the bookstore, that's what it's called, in Lenox. And all you need to do is just call them up to order it. So yeah, highly recommended. So John Weintraub writes, can you explain Elvis's relationships with women as you did in the book? Sounds like you read it.
Hi, John. Oh boy, he liked women in his bed. He wanted women around him all the time, and preferably in his bed. But it wasn't all about sex. It was about the company. It was about necking and about kissing. And it was about the company of women. He adored women, loved them. It was difficult being married. Priscilla, has written her own story about being married to Elvis. He was not an easy person to be married to. And he wasn't really a big fan of marriage, according to what I read. But he was a lover of women, and one of the members of the Memphis Mafia, who never got written about until and I say this, without, feeling like I'm bragging or anything, but no one has ever written about Patty Perry, who was a Jewish woman who became part of his Memphis Mafia when they were out in Hollywood. And I tell her story. She was like his little sister or his Jewish mother, but he loved women. He loved his mother, and I think that's why he loved women. The relationship between him and his mother was extraordinary, worth reading about. And when people say that when she died at such a young age, he was only 23 when she died, it was the greatest loss of his life, and that he was never the same again. He, by the way, died at the age of 42.
So young. Wow, thank you. Yvonne writes, I heard that Elvis gave a fortune to the Jewish community in Memphis when they were fundraising. Is that true?
Absolutely true. This man was among the most generous people I have ever read about. When Alan and I went to Graceland, there is in one of the display areas, museums, a plaque of the over 50 charities that he gave money to. Black charities, Jewish charities. They gave him free membership in the Jewish Community Center. He gave thousands of dollars to the Jewish Community Center after that. In the name, at one time he did it in the memory of Alan Fortas's parents. In other words, the brother of Abe Fortas. So he was generous to his friends, generous to charities, generous to the poor, gave enormous amounts of money to Jewish causes. and to the
Fabulous.
school, by the way, that the rabbi had been the head of.
Amazing. From Frank, if Elvis was such a proud person about Jewish heritage, why did he keep it secret?
Well, he didn't. He told people who were close to him. Actually, I'll tell you who kept it secret. Vernon and the Colonel. The Colonel is known to have said, I don't much think this is going to do, this won't do much for your image out in the hinterland. In other words, your Southern friends are not going to like hearing this. And so it didn't get out there a lot, it's true. But it was something he was aware of and from the beginning proud of, as evidenced by the star on the gravesite and so on.
Thank you.
His handlers didn't like it.
And Elise asked, do we know if Elvis ever attended a Jewish service?
You know, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I know that he went into Black churches. He loved Black gospel. He loved to sing. I mean, the relationship between Elvis and African Americans is another book. I'm not going to be writing it, but somebody should. He loved African Americans, and there's many photographs online of him with famous Black singers. He loved their music. When he was 13, 12, he listened to the Black music stations. It was a passion of his. And frankly, early on, when he would be at a nightclub or something, before he became really famous, and he would sing some of these songs that he was passionate about, some of these Southerners would walk out of the club because they didn't want to listen to race music. That's what they called Black music, race music. And he's responsible in part for that music reaching white ears, and it only helped African American singers.
Wow, great, thank you. Let's see, so many questions. I lost the one that I was going to ask next. Randy asks, Elvis is famous for singing gospel. Did he record any songs in Hebrew or Yiddish?
He did not. As I said, the only thing I could find was that little snippet on YouTube of the Hava Nagila. But Jeanette, the rabbi's wife, she believes that she hears, little elements of the sound of the minor key and key in some of the music that he sang. But I would say that that's more likely because the songwriters were Jewish and they grew up with Jewish music. And so some of that came into their rock and roll songs.
I'm gonna have to look for that YouTube clip.
Pardon?
I said, I'm gonna have to look for that YouTube clip. That sounds great. Sally Hecht asks, are his heirs interested in their Jewish heritage?
Oh boy. Wow. I could get teary again. I'll tell you why. Well, first, let me just say that Priscilla was very aware of his connection with Larry Geller and the discussion of the Jewish religion and so on. And relatives of Elvis will have testified that his interest in world religions was profound. He was interested in everybody's way of worship, and he respected all of those differences. In fact, he also learned about Indian, Eastern philosophies, and he went to the Self-Realization Institute out in Santa Monica, where Larry recommended he go, and he learned to meditate. He got into all kinds of practices that are fascinating. That, in fact, when he was in this Jewish dentist's chair, the dentist wanted to give him some Novocaine or something, and Elvis said, no, no, no. And he began to meditate. And through the whole thing, he felt no pain. So, I mean, he was truly, into all of these things. But in terms of his relatives, they were all aware of his interest in these other religions and so on. And I don't know much about Lisa, his daughter, but her son, Benjamin Keogh, who was in the news very sadly a few months ago because he committed suicide at a very young age, early 20s, I think. Benjamin, there's a photograph of Benjamin wearing a high around his neck. And I was going to include that in the book, and I said, no, I'm just going to, you know, leave it with Elvis. But it's clear they all were aware of his affinity to Jews and his love of Judaism.
Beautiful. And Abigail asked, you began to discuss the Hebrew influence of Elvis's name. Can you discuss that some more?
So I don't know. I don't know if I can find it in the book right away, but you know, I would have to really, you know, thumb through the book to get that. But it has to, this idea of power and worship, and you see in many synagogue names, Bethel, it has to do with that. If I had time, I would leaf through the book and get that for you. But it's definitely, it was so amazing to him that it had to do with this sort of power. And his name had a powerful meaning. And so he was very proud of that. And he loved to explore the meanings of different words and so on. He was a reader. And by the way, he would make notes in the margins of the books that Larry gave him. And these notes are profound, which you can see in Larry has included some of those photographs in his books. He read those books. They meant something to him. And Larry, unfortunately, it was tragic when it happened. And Larry, I think I didn't mention this maybe, but Larry started out his friendship with Elvis when he became his hairdresser. And it was Larry who at the very end prepared his hair for the coffin. They loved each other, and they had a beautiful relationship, and could talk a lot more about that. But read the book to find out the Hebrew language that Elvis was fascinated by, because it is worth reading.
Wonderful. Yeah, and someone else, that El is a name that means God, so that would definitely be powerful. And David Barnett has posted 2 YouTube links, one to Elvis singing Hava Nagila and one to Elvis speaking and singing in Hebrew.
Wonderful.
Fascinating. So we'll send those. It's in the chat now, but we'll put them in the email also.
Wonderful.
You don't catch it right now. A couple of people have asked about Elvis's movie career and whether he had many Jewish experiences when he was making movies.
Well, he made 31 movies, and there are 2 chapters in the book. One was about the songwriters, his Jewish songwriters, and another is about the Jews in Hollywood and television that he befriended. I single out the ones that made the most, like there were, I think Hal Wallace and Norman Torrig made at least 9 movies with Elvis. Even though Michael Curtiz only made 1, it was a very powerful one. It was King Creole, and he had a wonderful relationship with him. He called him Elvie. Curtiz was from Europe, and he called Elvis Elvie. I should say that that one of the neighbors in the Pinch called Elvis Elvisol, which is affection, a form of affection. He was called many things by different people who would shorten that name. But the directors and the producers of most of his films were Jews and have fascinating stories of their own in terms of their Jewish roots and their relationship with him. And I will not say emphatically that it's because they were Jews that he had these relationships with them, but I think it had to have had some influence. And they all loved him. They all said he was a truly wonderful man.
Beautiful. And Mary Wah wants to know, did his father ever come around in terms of his attitude towards Jewish people?
Well, I don't know that ever happened, but I will say that, his father was in part responsible. The father and the colonel were in part responsible for getting rid of Larry Geller because of his influence on Elvis. They said, you're giving him too many books. He's not paying attention to the music. Whether they said that out loud to Larry or not, it was clear that, and they would make up, they would call him Lawrence of Arabia and things like that. I mean, they would give him names that were derogatory because he was getting in the way of that relationship that they had with Elvis. So Larry wisely left before it got really bad, and then a few years later came back. But in terms of Vernon and Larry, there's no question there was not great feeling Vernon had towards Larry. But at the end, when Elvis died, Vernon said to Larry, "My boy really liked you, and I want you to do his hair for his casket." I don't know how significant it was, but it was pretty significant when I read about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Les Chrysler has a story to share. He says that Elvis gave a car to an ENT doctor in Las Vegas who saw him for a throat ailment. Early in his career, he had no money, and the doctor had seen him at no charge after other doctors had turned him away. And Les says, he's a retired ENT, and this is the lore in our profession. This is the Elvis story for ENTs.
That's great.
That's so sweet.
Yeah.
I love that.
There are so many Elvis stories. Oh my God. They're endless. And I tried to tell a lot of them. Great.
So Lori Braun asked, can you talk about GK, the DJ in Elvis?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, I can tell a couple things. I mean, I talk a lot about GK. I talked to GK. I don't
know who GK is.
Oh, I'm sorry, George Klein. He was the young man who befriended Elvis at Humes High School. When all these guys are bullying Elvis because he's wearing these poor clothes, and before he started getting snazzy and he wore these jeans and stuff. By the way, Elvis hated jeans because it represented his poverty. And so here was George, and he became his friend. And George was a really nice guy, and they really had a friendship that went from the age of 16 years old, and no, younger. He met him in 8th grade. Sorry, he met him in 8th grade till the day he died. In fact, George, I talked to George on the phone. God, may he rest in peace. He was the most recent one to die among the Jews in the inner circle. George was old by the time, quite old by the time I talked with him, and he didn't sort of like the idea of my book because it would compete with his book. But hey, there's room for all kinds of Elvis books. But he was nice enough, and I did get to see him. Alan and I got to see him when we were down in Memphis. He had a program. He had a radio program where he played Elvis music right on the grounds of the not Graceland itself, but of the museum area. He had his own little area. You could see through the glass. You could see George spinning Elvis records. So he had a very long and meaningful relationship, shall we say. He was a DJ. He was there for Elvis whenever he needed him. Even when he was a DJ, he would travel with Elvis. He was a part of it. Elvis was his best man, and Elvis, George talks about Elvis talking to the rabbi and so on, that married George and his wife. There's endless stories. I don't know where to start other than to say that George and Elvis were close from the time they were in 8th grade until the time that Elvis died, and that George was there for Elvis if Elvis needed him, and Elvis was there when George needed him, because George got into a bit of trouble. George was found to have, there's these ranks on radio programs and so on, and the ratings and so on. He was supposed to have somehow broken the law and shown him his his program on radio to be higher rated than it was. And he was actually arrested for this kind of breaking the law. And Elvis helped him, he did serve a little bit of jail time, George did. and Elvis was standing by. In fact, he contacted President Carter on George's behalf. I mean, just far out stories like this, because hey, I met Nixon, I can get in touch with Carter, and maybe he'll help George get off and not have to go to prison. But that never did happen because they never were able to talk on the phone and so on. But Carter was a lover of Elvis's music and praised Elvis after his death very, very much. But he didn't help George get off the jail term. There's lots more to George, but you know, have to read the book.
There you go. And just in another quick note from Stephen Meisel, he says that he did business with Bernard and Hal Lansky in the late 80s and 90s, and they were fun, nice, decent men.
Yes, yes. Many articles, by the way, were written. I know that name, Steve Meisel. I read many articles about the Lansky Brothers store, and I use some of them and I refer to them in the book, because the stories are great. I mean, really great. Tommy Hilfiger, is that his name? Anyway, Tommy Hilfiger even talks about, you know, Elvis and his clothes, and the Lansky's clothes that were sold. Yeah, the Lansky Brothers, I think when Bernard died, Hal said that it was that obituary even showed up in Saudi Arabia. And then he said to me, I wonder if they knew he was Jewish.
Wow. And Peter asks, how did Elvis feel about going to Germany as a soldier?
This guy was a patriot. You know, Elvis really did love his country, and he wanted to, you know, be there for his country. And this is, by the way, this is a more positive side of the colonel, because the colonel liked the idea of not giving him special, you know, treatment and so on when he was over there. Nevertheless, he did have somewhat of a special situation, because a couple of his Memphis Mafia were there, as well as, you know, he had headquarters where he had sort of his own place to stay and so on. Oh, by the way, who's it? Art Buchwald. This is just another one of the people at the end of the book, there are 10 profiles, very short profiles of people who had something to do with Elvis. And Art Buchwald was over there in Europe when Elvis took a weekend to go to Paris. And he saw him at this hotel or something, and he said, so Elvis, what are you doing tonight? And Elvis, because he looked a little bit lost. Elvis wasn't much of a, you know, a tourist type. And Elvis said, nothing. He said, well, I'm going to show you around Paris. And he took him to a club, and Elvis goes backstage, and he ends up singing to the chorus girls right into the early morning. And Art Buchwald says at the end of this thing that I read that there's a photograph somewhere of me standing next to Elvis, and I can't find it. But, you know, he was one of those wonderful Jewish journalists and humorists that Elvis got to know in a very nice way. But as far as the Germany, you know, on a sadder note, I read something to the effect that that's where he started taking some of those drugs, some of the prescription drugs, to stay awake on guard duty and things like that. I don't know if that's absolutely true, but that's been said. Oh, I could add something now, by the way, if you want. One thing that will really knock people out. You want to know where the biggest fan of Elvis Presley is located? In Israel, in a restaurant gas station owned by Yuri Yoeli, and it's called the Elvis American Diner. I have photographs of that in the book. This man, it's a long story, but he was a fan of Elvis's, and pretty soon he started, his wife didn't like the memorabilia hanging around the house, so Yuri started putting it at his restaurant and gas station, and now apparently this is a pilgrimage site. It is a pilgrimage site. People go to, it's between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where it's located, the Elvis American Diner, and people go there. There are 4 statues. He had 4 statues of Elvis made. He has more kitsch in that restaurant than you can imagine. The music starts playing 9 in the morning until the night, and people are dancing in the aisles in the morning after their breakfast. So it's an amazing story to think that, you know, and the sad thing is Elvis didn't know about this, you know. He would have been so happy to know that, you know, the Israelis love him. So.
Very sweet. And we'll want to wind up, and then if you want to tell any final story, but that would be lovely. We do have a couple more questions about the story about his relationship with the rabbi, which is so lovely. And people just wanted to know, how old was he when he lived under the rabbi's apartment, and how long did he live in the same building?
He was really, it was just the beginning of his you know, his rise to stardom. He was 18 years old, and he just graduated from high school, and he had just cut that record, That's All Right, Mama. And so, and they were only in the same place for a year, approximately a year. But it was a very intensive kind of relationship. I remember I could tell a million stories. One of the stories is when he graduated from high school, Jeanette bought him a cufflink set. And he thought he had just been given the world's largest diamond. He was so appreciative. He said, I never could afford anything like this. Thank you so much. He hugged her, took her around, and said, thank you so much. This is a cufflink set. Elvis Presley, 18 years old. Jeanette loved him, and she said, as I said, it felt like he was one of her, you know, her children. And that, speaking of that, I don't know if I mentioned that the rabbi and his wife started to have a family at that time. And when she brought home her second born or her firstborn, I'm not sure. I have to look that back up. When she brought home one of her babies, Elvis ran out to greet her and said, Mrs. Fruchter, please let me have the honor of carrying your baby into the house. He did the same thing when she was loaded with groceries. He'd run out and say, I'll carry that upstairs for you. Please let me do that for you. This is Elvis Presley, our icon, and he deserves that status for more reasons than we used to think. We thought iconic because he's a genius in music, but I say iconic because he was a mensch, like Jeanette said.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Roselle. This has been such a lovely talk and such a lovely story, and it really kind of helps, I think, us to, you know, renew our faith in this crazy mixed up country we live in. And you know, the people, you know, the knowing that someone who's such an icon to so many, you know, was so welcoming and accepting of all people. It really, I'm sure, I know someone else wrote, I think, that this was really a balm in this tumultuous week to hear these stories. And I know that
for me too, it was a balm for me too, because what had happened 2 days ago is not something he would have been able to tolerate. And there's no question what he would have said about it. He would have been horrified.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I know there's so many more stories, and there were more questions than we could get to, but we encourage you to buy the book. It is available on Amazon.com. It's called The Jewish World of Elvis Presley. It was just published. You can also buy it from the bookstore in Lenox if you're local, and pick it up at the curb and support a local bookstore while you're doing it. And we will be including that information, links to purchase it, and the phone number for the bookstore, as well as those Elvis YouTube videos in our follow-up email and a recording of tonight. So Roselle, did you have any last words?
I only have the following words. I want to thank each and every one of you out there for listening and hopefully enjoying what you heard. And for me, for someone who has written about prejudice and tolerance for more than 45 years, I wanted to share with you this side of Elvis Presley, which is not well known. so that you would come to not just enjoy his music, and I know some of you do love his music, his gospel is incredible, but that you would come to love him as a person, because he was a good soul.
Beautiful. Thanks so much. Thank you, Roselle. Happy birthday, Elvis. We were thought about making a cake, but, and you know, go have some banana and peanut butter and challah, and think of Elvis today, and enjoy his music, and enjoy knowing a much more unexpected and well-rounded picture of him that we're really grateful to.
Please do listen to his music, because, you know, it's interesting. Most of the people who wrote his Christmas songs, or a lot of them, were Jews. So I found that fascinating, but his music is incredible. I just want to mention one album, If I Can Dream, it's called, and it was Elvis posthumously connected to the London Philharmonic Orchestra. And so you have this gorgeous sound of an orchestra, and Elvis singing some of his most famous, most wonderful rock and roll and slower songs. It's a beautiful album, and I listen to it all the time, and I sometimes dance around the kitchen, and I definitely sing along with it. So I think it's called If I Can Dream. It's just a beautiful way of being reminded of what a genius he was.
Nice. I'll look for that and put a link for that in there in the email too. Well, have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thank you again. Thank you, Roselle.
My pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, Megan. Bye, everyone.